There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the spaces where a titan once stood. It is not merely the absence of noise, but the heavy, pressurized vacuum left behind when a monolith of culture, history, and human vice is surgically excised from the timeline. If you were to walk down Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles today, past the frantic commute of the modern world, past the concrete and the glass that reflects nothing but the hollow gaze of the 21st century, you would feel it. You would feel the phantom limb of a city that has amputated its own heart. We are not speaking of a mere building. We are speaking of a gravitational center that pulled the stars of the Golden Age into its orbit. A fortress of opulence that promised to insulate its inhabitants from the crushing banal reality of the outside world. This is the story of a disappearance. Not a magic trick, but a slow, agonizing erasure that took decades to complete. A tragedy of architecture where the victim was not a person, but a palace. To understand why the world's most luxurious hotel vanished, why the Ambassador Hotel and specifically its beating heart, the Coconut Grove was ground into dust and scattered into the landfill of memory, we must first understand the physics of a dream. We must understand that buildings, like the humans who construct them, have lifespans. They have distinct physiologies. They have souls that can be corrupted, blackened, and eventually exorcised. Imagine the year 1921. The air in California smells different than it is sweet with the scent of orange blossoms and the sharper, more metallic temps of new money. The land upon which our tragedy will unfold is not yet paved over. It is a dairy farm, a vast expanse of pastoral silence located 3 miles from the frantic, burgeoning center of downtown Los Angeles. It is here that a group of men, driven by that particularly American strain of hubris that believes one can purchase immortality if the check is large enough, decide to construct a city within a city. They do not want a hotel, they want a sanctuary. They want a Mediterranean revival colossus that will dominate the skyline. A structure so imposing and yet so inviting that it will redefine the very concept of leisure for the next half-century. When the ground is broken, it is not just dirt that is moved. It is the tectonic shifting of social strata. They pour concrete into the earth as if they are pouring the foundation of a new religion. The architects, Schultz and Weaver, the same minds that would later give New York its pier and its Waldorf Astoria, draft plans that are less like blueprints and more like sacred geometries intended to capture light, sound, and status. The construction itself is a violent act of creation. Hundreds of men swarm the skeleton of the beast, riveting steel, laying brick, sweating under the relentless California sun to raise a structure that is destined to house the gods of the silver screen. When the doors finally open in the winter of 1921, the world does not just enter, it gasps. To step into the lobby of the Ambassador was to step out of time. The floor beneath your feet was not merely marble. It was a cooling expanse of stone, quarried from the veins of Italian mountains, polished until it reflected the faces of the damned and the divine with equal clarity. The chandeliers above did not just provide light, they dripped with crystal teardrops that caught the illumination and shattered it into a million prismatic rainbows, casting a spectral glow over the velvet furnishings, the deep mahogany, and the restless, prowling figures of the elite. The scale of it was oppressive in its grandeur. It was designed to make you feel small, to remind you that you were a guest in the house of something greater than yourself. The air inside was conditioned, filtered, and perfumed. A distinct atmospheric blend of expensive tobacco, Shalima perfume, and the crisp ozone scent of freshly printed money. But to truly understand the disappearance, we must look closer at the organism when it was alive. We must zoom in until the grain of the film dissolves into chaos. Picture a Tuesday evening in 1928. The sun has dipped below the Pacific, casting a bruised purple twilight over the palm trees that line the driveway. A limousine, black and gleaming like a beetle's carapace, pulls up to the porte cochere. The door opens. A flashbulb pops, a miniature supernova igniting for a fraction of a second to steal a soul. Inside the car sits a woman whose face is projected on screens 40 feet high across the globe. She steps out. The sound of her heel striking the pavement is the only sound that matters. She enters the hotel, and the hotel swallows her whole. This was the function of the ambassador: digestion. It consumed the famous and gave them a place to hide in plain sight. It was a cavern of secrets. The walls were thick, insulated not just against the heat, but against the truth. Within these rooms, affairs were consummated that would shatter marriages. Deals were struck that would merge corporations, and bottles were emptied that would ruin livers. The hotel was a silent accomplice to every vice of the Jazz Age. It is crucial to linger on the texture of this existence. To rush through the glory years is to disrespect the tragedy of the fall. You must understand the sensation of the linen's Egyptian cotton with a thread count that felt like water against the skin. You must visualize the silverware, heavy and cold, resting on tablecloths of blinding white, the tines of the forks straightening to attention like soldiers. In the Coconut Grove, the hotel's legendary nightclub, the artifice reached its zenith. Here, Papier, MCH, palm trees, rescued from the set of a Rudolph Valentino film, stood as sentinels over a dance floor that saw the Charleston evolve into the swing, and the swing dissolve into the twist. Stuffed monkeys with glowing amber eyes peered down from the artificial canopy, silent witnesses to the unraveling of inhibitions. Above them, a ceiling painted with stars offered a counterfeit heaven to those who had likely forfeited their place in the real one. The music was a physical force, a wall of brass and percussion that vibrated in the chest cavity, overriding the heartbeat, syncing the pulse of 1,000 people to the rhythm of the conductor's baton. It was hypnotic. It was a machine designed to manufacture euphoria on an industrial scale. However, even in the midst of this blinding luminosity, the seeds of the disappearance were already being sown. There is a law of thermodynamics that applies to luxury. Entropy is inevitable. The energy required to maintain such a hermetically sealed illusion is astronomical. It requires a constant infusion of capital, of attention, and of relevance. The ambassador was a creature of its time, and times, as we know, are cruel and migratory. But before we trace the cracks in the foundation, before we watch the paint begin to peel and the velvet begin to mold, we must pause. We must acknowledge that you, the viewer, are currently walking these halls with me. You are a ghost in this narrative. And just as the ambassador required a guest list to function, this channel requires a roster of those willing to endure the long, dark descent into history's oubliettes. If you wish to secure your reservation in this archive of lost things, if you want to ensure that you are notified when we unearth the next relic from the dust, I invite you to click the subscribe button now. Consider it your signature in the guest book, a permanent record that you were here, witnessing the autopsy of the past, before the lights go out completely. Do not let the algorithm bury this signal. Join us now, return to the lobby. The year is moving forward, the pages of the calendar turning with the relentless rustle of dried leaves. We are moving into the 1940s and 1950s. The hotel is still a titan, but the world around it is shifting. The city of Los Angeles is spreading out like a stain, expanding westward, pulling the center of gravity away from Wilshire Boulevard towards Beverly Hills and Bel Air. The ambassador is beginning to look less like a pioneer and more like a fortress under siege. Yet, it fights back with glamour. It hosts the Academy Awards. It becomes the home away from home for every president from Hoover to Nixon. It is the site of the Golden Globes. It is seemingly invincible. But look closer at the details. The fabric on the chairs in the lobby is being replaced, not with the same Italian silk, but with a domestic blend that is durable but lacks the same cold, slippery touch of true aristocracy. The staff, once composed of career professionals who saw service as a high calling, is beginning to cycle through with greater speed. The institutional memory is thinning. The physiology of the building begins to suffer from the sheer weight of its own history. The plumbing, miles of copper arteries hidden behind the plaster, begins to corrode. The electrical grid, tasked with powering the ever-increasing demands of television cameras and air conditioning units, hums with a dangerous, feverish heat. The hotel is an aging body, still capable of putting on a tuxedo and charming the room, but wheezing when it climbs the stairs. And then, there is the darkness that begins to seep in from the edges. The glamorous isolation that was once its selling point begins to feel like entrapment. The world outside the gates is becoming louder, more violent, less deferential to the old gods of Hollywood. We must scrutinize the bungalows, those private, detached cottages scattered across the hotel's 24 acres. These were the true inner sanctuary. It was here that Howard Hughes lived, sealing himself off from the microbes of the public, surrounded by stacks of Kleenex and the hum of film projectors. It was here that Marilyn Monroe posed by the pool, her smile a fragile defense mechanism against a world that wanted to devour her. The bungalows were the subconscious of the hotel, the places where the public mask was dropped, and the raw, often ugly reality of fame was allowed to fester. If those walls could speak, they would not sing show tunes, they would scream. They absorbed the tears of starlets who didn't get the part, the rage of producers who lost the financing, the quiet desperation of writers trying to punch up a script that was already dead on arrival. By the late 1960s, the atmosphere inside the Ambassador had changed. The air was no longer just perfumed. It was charged with static electricity. The country was tearing itself apart. The Vietnam War was a televised nightmare playing out in the living rooms of America. The civil rights movement was burning in the streets. And the Ambassador, once a sanctuary, was about to become a crime scene. This is the pivot point. This is the moment where the narrative shifts from a romance to a horror story. We are approaching the event horizon of June 1968. But to simply say Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated is to fail the mandate of this investigation. We must understand the room. We must understand the pantry. We must understand the specific molecular composition of the air in the embassy room that night. It was hot. The air conditioning was struggling against the body heat of thousands of supporters. There was a smell of cheap champagne, sweat, cigarette smoke, and the metallic temps of adrenaline. Balloons, red, white, and blue, bobbed against the ceiling like trapped spirits. The noise was deafening a roar of hope, a desperate clawing hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the country could be pulled back from the brink. RFK was the avatar of that hope. He moved through the crowd, not like a politician, but like a rock star, a messiah in a suit. He had just won the California primary. He spoke of unity, he spoke of ending the violence. And then, he left the podium. He was guided towards the kitchen pantry, a shortcut intended to avoid the crushing press of the media. The transition from the ballroom to the pantry is a transition from the stage to the backstage, from the illusion to the machinery. The pantry was not glamorous. It was a narrow corridor of concrete and stainless steel. It smelled of steam tables, dish soap, and old grease. It was bright, lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that cast no shadows and offered no mercy. It was here, in this utilitarian intestine of the hotel, that the end began. When Sirhan stepped forward, when the .22 caliber revolver was raised, it was not just a bullet that was fired. It was a kill shot aimed at the heart of the Ambassador itself. The chaos that followed is difficult to describe with mere words, but we must try. The sound of the shots pop sounded like firecrackers, like a celebration gone wrong. Then the screams, the sudden violent contraction of the crowd, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the smell of roasting meat from the kitchen. The flashbulbs popping now, not for glamour, but for evidence. The sight of the busboy, Juan Romero, cradling the head of the falling senator, the rosary beads pressed into the dying hand. That image, burned into the retina of the world, was the death warrant for the hotel. How do you go back to dancing in the coconut grove when the blood of a Kennedy is staining the concrete just a few yards away? How do you sell luxury when the specter of political violence haunts the corridors? The Ambassador did not close immediately, it lingered. It trundled on like a zombie, a reanimated corpse going through the motions of hospitality. But the soul had fled. The silence we spoke of at the beginning began to encroach. The guests stopped coming. The stars moved to the Beverly Hilton, to the Century Plaza, to hotels that didn't smell of tragedy. The decline was slow, humiliating, and absolute. The neighborhood around the hotel began to change, reflecting the urban decay that was plaguing inner cities across America in the 70s and 80s. the Ambassador became an island of dilapidation, a fortress protecting nothing. As we stare into this abyss, as we watch the lights dim in the lobby for the last time, we must prepare ourselves for the autopsy of the structure itself. We have witnessed the death of the spirit. Next, we must witness the death of the body. The long, agonizing legal battles, the squatters, the rats that replaced the debutantes, the transformation of the most luxurious hotel in the world into a filming location for movies about the apocalypse. It is a cruel irony that the hotel found a second life playing itself as a ruin, a backdrop for fiction, before it was finally erased from the earth. The silence that descended upon the Ambassador in the years following 1968 was not the peace of a cathedral, but the uneasy quiet of a crime scene tape fluttering in the wind. The bullet that struck Robert Kennedy had lodged itself in the structural integrity of the hotel's reputation. A piece of lead poisoning the bloodstream of the entire enterprise. For the next 2 decades, the Ambassador attempted to exist in a state of cognitive dissonance, pretending that it was still the epicenter of Los Angeles high society, while the city outside its gates metamorphosed into something harder, grittier, and infinitely more cynical. The 1970s arrived not with a fanfare, but with a creeping malaise. The aesthetic of the era burnt orange, avocado green, the heavy, suffocating shag carpets began to overlay the pristine Italian marble like a fungus. The management, desperate to staunch the bleeding of revenue, made choices that, in retrospect, feel like the frantic thrashing of a drowning man. They modernized, they renovated. They committed the cardinal sin of historic architecture. They tried to be trendy. They covered the intricate plasterwork with drop ceilings to save on heating bills. They painted over the frescoes. They installed fluorescent lights that buzzed with the headache-inducing frequency of a cheap motel. It is a tragedy of aesthetics as much as economics. Imagine the indignity of a grand dame forced to wear the cheap costume jewelry of a disco teenager. The Coconut Grove, once a forest of dreams with its mechanical monkeys and star-filled ceiling, was retooled. It became the Now Grove for a brief, humiliating period. The name itself reeks of desperation, a plea to be considered relevant by a generation that had already moved on to the whiskey-soaked clubs of the Sunset Strip or the cocaine-dusted discotheques of Studio 54. The stars who came now were not the icons of the silver screen Garbo Chaplin Crawford, but the fading echoes of a bygone era, touring acts trying to squeeze the last drops of nostalgia from a drying sponge. The audience had changed. The tuxedos and gowns were replaced by polyester suits and wide lapels. The air was no longer filled with the scent of expensive cigars, but with the cloying chemical haze of hairspray and the stale smoke of mass-market cigarettes. And outside, Wilshire Boulevard was dying. The Miracle Mile was losing its miracle. The wealthy demographic that had sustained the hotel for 50 years was fleeing west, retreating behind the manicured hedges of Beverly Hills and the gated communities of Bel Air. They looked at the Ambassador not with fondness, but with the pity one reserves for an elderly relative who has lost control of their faculties. The neighborhood surrounding the hotel began to fray. Storefronts went vacant, their windows staring out like empty eye sockets. Graffiti, the hieroglyphics of urban decay, began to appear on the periphery of the hotel's 24 acres. The sirens grew louder, more frequent, piercing the thin illusion of sanctuary that the hotel tried so desperately to maintain. The fortress was no longer keeping the world out. It was locking the decay in. By the 1980s, the Ambassador was a ghost ship sailing through a concrete ocean. Walking the corridors in those final years was an exercise in archaeology. You could see the layers of history peeling away. A chip in the wall would reveal the 1920s plaster beneath the 1950s paint. A worn patch of carpet would expose the hardwood that had once felt the footsteps of presidents. The physiological breakdown of the building accelerated. The pipes, elderly and calcified, wept water into the walls, creating bloom patterns of mold that looked like bruised maps of unknown countries. The elevators, once silent gliders of brass and steel, groaned and shuddered, reluctant to carry their dwindling cargo. The staff, now a skeleton crew of loyalists, and those with nowhere else to go, moved through the cavernous spaces like caretakers of a mausoleum. They polished brass that no one looked at. They set tables for guests who never arrived. There is a profound melancholia in a service industry without anyone to serve. It becomes a ritual performed for the sake of the ritual itself, a liturgy to a dead god. Then came the end. It was not an explosion, but a whimper. In 1989, the decision was made. The math simply no longer worked. The land was worth more than the dream. The closing of the Ambassador was a bureaucratic execution, signed in triplicate. But the moment the doors were locked for the final time, something strange happened. The hotel did not die. It entered a state of suspended animation. It became a time capsule, sealed against the oxygen of the present. When the last employee walked out, they left behind a world frozen in amber. Calendars on the walls remained turned to 1989. In the kitchens, industrial mixers stood coated in a thin film of flour that would slowly turn to grey dust. In the administrative offices, files were left on desks. Rotary phones sat silent on their cradles. And memos regarding upcoming events fluttered in the stagnant air conditioning drafted from nowhere. For nearly 2 decades, the Ambassador stood empty. This is the Phantom period, the era that I find most fascinating, and perhaps most terrifying. It became a hollow mountain in the middle of the city. Nature, sensing the vacuum, began to reclaim it. Weeds punched through the asphalt of the tennis courts where champions had once played. Vines crept up the stucco walls, their tendrils seeking purchase in the cracks of the facade. The pool, once a turquoise jewel where Olympic swimmers had trained, was drained, leaving behind a concrete scar filled with dead leaves, rainwater, and the carcasses of insects. It was a ruin in the romantic, 19th century sense of the word, a place where the hubris of man was slowly being digested by time. But Hollywood, in its infinite cynicism, found a use for the corpse. The Ambassador became the industry's favorite backlot. Because it was empty, because it was grand, and because it was relatively cheap, it became the go-to location for films that required a sense of faded glory or institutional menace. It is a supreme irony that the hotel, which was built to house the stars, spent its afterlife pretending to be other places. It was the hotel in Pretty Woman where Julia Roberts learns which fork to use, a scene of etiquette filmed in a place that had lost all its own. It was the ballroom in Forrest Gump. It was the seedy, rain-slicked backdrop for countless music videos and crime procedurals. It played hospitals, it played courtrooms, it played the lobbies of banks that were being robbed. If you watch these films now, you are engaging in a form of digital necromancy. You are seeing the ghost of the building performing its final roles. But the crews who worked there tell stories. They speak of the cold spots in the hallways. They speak of the feeling of being watched from the balcony of the Coconut Grove. They speak of the sound of party chatter drifting from empty rooms, the clink of non-existent glasses, the phantom smell of tobacco smoke in a building that had been non-smoking by law for years. The hotel had absorbed so much emotion, so much intense human experience, lest greed, ambition, despair, that it seemed to have developed a psychic residue. It was a battery charged with 80 years of high-voltage life, and it was slowly discharging into the darkness. During this limbo, a battle for the soul of the site began to rage. On one side, you had the developers, the titans of the new age. Most notably, Donald Trump, in the late 1980s, cast his golden gaze upon the property. He envisioned tearing it down to build the tallest building in the world, a monolith that would have pierced the sky and erased the footprint of the past entirely. He saw the Ambassador not as a monument, but as a blockage, an inefficiency in the real estate market. On the other side, you had the Los Angeles Unified School District, LOST. They saw the 24 acres not as a luxury site, but as a necessity. The schools in the area were critically overcrowded, bursting at the seams. They needed the land to build a massive educational complex. And then, there were the preservationists. The Los Angeles Conservancy, the dreamers who believed that you could not simply throw away history because it was inconvenient. They argued that the Ambassador was a landmark, a cultural touchstone that belonged to the city's identity. This legal tripartite war dragged on for years. Lawsuits were filed, Injunctions were granted, appeals were heard, and all the while, the hotel sat there, rotting. The roof began to fail. Water damage turned the interior into a moldering cavern. Squatters found their way in, lighting small fires on the terrazzo floors to keep warm. The smoke curling up to blacken the crystal chandeliers that had once illuminated the faces of kings. Looters stripped the copper wiring, ripping the nervous system out of the walls. They stole the doorknobs, the fixtures, anything that could be melted down or sold for scrap. The ambassador was being cannibalized, piece by piece. While the lawyers argued in air-conditioned courtrooms about who owned the carcass, it raises a question that I want you to consider. A question that sits at the center of all urban exploration and historical preservation. As you visualize the mold growing over the velvet ropes of the coconut grove, ask yourself, does a building have a right to exist once its purpose is gone? Or are we, as a society, hoarding the shells of the past because we are terrified of the future? Is it better to let a legend die with dignity, or to keep it on life support until it becomes a monstrosity? Pause for a moment. Look at the room you are in right now. Look at the walls. Imagine them 50 years from now. Imagine the silence after you are gone. Who will walk through your space? What will they say about the way you lived? This is the horror of the ambassador. It is a mirror reflecting our own inevitable obsolescence. In 2001, the LAUSD finally won the battle. The courts ruled in their favor. The hotel would be demolished to make way for the Robert F. Kennedy Community Schools. The preservationists fought until the bitter end, pleading for adaptive reuse, begging to save at least the main tower, the lobby, the grove. But the structural assessments were damning. The building was deemed seismically unsafe, a hazard that would collapse at the first tremor of the darker future. The cost to retrofit it was astronomical. The logic of the spreadsheet defeated the logic of the heart. The death warrant was signed. The execution date was set. But before the wrecking balls swung, there was one final act. A massive auction was held. The contents of the hotel, everything that hadn't been stolen or destroyed by rot, were dragged out into the light of day to be sold to the highest bidder. It was a dismemberment. People bought the silverware, they bought the ashtrays, they bought chunks of the dance floor, they bought the letters from the marquee. It was a feeding frenzy of nostalgia. There is something deeply macabre about buying a piece of a dead hotel, like purchasing a relic of a saint, hoping that some of the magic, some of the stardust, is trapped in the object. Did they want a souvenir? Or did they want to own a piece of the ghosts? We are now standing at the precipice of the final destruction. The year is 2005. The fences are up. The heavy machinery is idling at the gates, diesel engines rumbling like the growl of predators. The preservationists are weeping outside the chain-link barriers. The cameras are rolling. The Ambassador Hotel, the Grand Dame of Wilshire, the throne of the Jazz Age, the altar of the Kennedy tragedy, is about to be unmade. The physics of demolition are brutal. It is the reversal of construction. It is the application of force to order, reducing complexity to chaos. We must prepare to watch the walls fall. We must prepare to see the sunlight hit the interior of the coconut grove for the first time in 84 years, not through a window, but through a gaping wound in the roof. The dust that will rise will be composed of plaster, of concrete, of asbestos, and of memories. Every particle of dust was once a witness to history. And as we watch it crumble, we must ask ourselves, when the building is gone, where do the ghosts go? Do they dissipate into the atmosphere like steam? Or do they cling to the coordinates, haunting the empty air where the floor used to be? The demolition of a memory is a violent, industrial act. We often speak of erasing the past, as if it were a pencil mark on a page that can be gently rubbed away with rubber. But architecture does not vanish gently. It fights, it screams. When the heavy machinery finally breached the perimeter of the Ambassador Hotel in late 2005 and early 2006, it was not a renovation. It was a dissection performed by excavators with jaws of hardened steel. The initial strikes were tentative, almost testing the resolve of the structure. But soon the rhythm of destruction established itself. The sound was a low-frequency rumble that vibrated in the ribcages of the onlookers gathered on Wilshire Boulevard, a thrumming bass note of annihilation. To watch a building like the Ambassador fall is to witness a profound violation of privacy. For 80 years, these walls had defined the boundary between the public and the private. They had shielded the intimate moments of the world's most scrutinized individuals. Now, the wrecking ball and the high-reach excavator peeled back the skin of the hotel, exposing its internal organs to the harsh, indifferent light of the Los Angeles sun. It was like seeing a dollhouse cut in half. Suddenly, you could see the wallpaper of a room where a starlet might have wept over a broken engagement. You could see the plumbing lines, the rusted iron veins that had carried water to the baths of presidents. You could see the color of the paint in the hallways. Layer upon layer of beige and cream, a geological stratification of changing tastes. The demolition turned the hotel inside out. What was once hermetic and sacred became open and profane. The dust that rose from the site was not merely particulate matter. It was a suspension of history. When the walls of the coconut grove were finally breached, a cloud billowed out that tasted of old plaster, pulverized velvet, and 80 years of dried tobacco smoke. The demolition crews were breathing in the Jazz Age. They were inhaling the microscopic debris of the swing era. It is a haunting thought that the physical substance of the past, when destroyed, enters the lungs of the living. The demolition of the grove was particularly painful to witness. This was the temple of the night. The fake palm trees, those iconic kitschy sentinels of the party, were snapped like twigs. The Moorish arches, which had framed the entrances of kings and queens, were crumbled into aggregate. The ceiling, painted with its artificial constellations, was torn open to reveal the true, smog-choked sky of modern Los Angeles. The illusion was shattered, and the reality that replaced it was ugly, jagged, and gray. However, the destruction was not uniform. The assassination site, the pantry, posed a unique metaphysical problem. How do you destroy a place where a soul was ripped from the world? To simply bulldoze the spot where Robert F. Kennedy fell felt like a desecration, a second assassination. The air in that narrow corridor was heavy with a different kind of gravity. While the rest of the hotel was torn down with brute force, the pantry was treated with the reverence of an archaeological dig or a crime scene investigation. It was not demolished, it was dismantled. Preservationists and historians worked alongside the demolition crews. Sections of the wall, the actual physical matter that had absorbed the sound waves of the gunshots, were surgically removed. They were crated, catalogued, and carted away to storage facilities, arguably to be preserved as relics of a national trauma. But the space itself, geometric coordinates where the event happened, could not be moved. The void remained. When the ceiling of the pantry was removed, the column of air where Kennedy had stood was exposed to the elements. The specific darkness of that hallway was bleached out by the sun. As the excavators dug deeper, churning the earth to prepare for the foundation of the new school, the site began to yield its secrets. This is the forensic phase of the disappearance. The Ambassador was not just a building on top of the dirt. It was a civilization that had pressed its debris into the soil. Workers found bottles of Prohibition-era liquor hidden in wall cavities, stash spots that had been forgotten for 70 years. They found newspapers from the 1940s used as insulation. Their headlines shouting about the war in the Pacific, frozen in time behind the plaster. They found menus, ticket stubs, room keys, the detritus of 1 million transient lives. Each object was a ghost story, a tangible anchor to a narrative that had been cut short. These artifacts were pulled from the wreckage like shrapnel from a wound. They were reminders that the hotel was not just a structure, but a vessel of human intent. We must pause here, in the midst of the rubble, to ask a question that cuts to the bone of this entire investigation. It is a question that I want you to answer in the comments below, because your perception of this tragedy defines its legacy. Do you believe that a place can retain the energy of the events that happened there? Or is haunting simply a projection of our own collective memory onto inert matter? Does the land remember the blood, or do we? Leave your thoughts, I read them all. Now, back to the pit. By 2008, The Ambassador Hotel was gone. The skyline of Wilshire Boulevard had a gap in its teeth. The 24 acres were a flat, scarred expanse of brown dirt. It was a tabula rasa, a blank slate. But in Los Angeles, land never stays empty for long. The pressure of the present is too great. The Los Angeles Unified School District began the construction of the Robert F. Kennedy Community Schools. The project was titanically expensive, costing nearly $578 million, making it the most expensive public school complex ever built in the United States. The irony is staggering. The site of the ultimate exclusivity, a playground for the wealthy elite, was being transformed into the site of ultimate inclusivity, a public institution for the children of the working class, many of them immigrants, living in the dense, concrete jungle of Koreatown. The architects of the new school were faced with an impossible task. They had to build on a graveyard. They had to respect the ghost while serving the living. What they chose to do was to build a simulacrum. They created a ghost image of the original hotel. If you stand on Wilshire Boulevard today and look at the school, you will experience a moment of intense déjà vu. The main building of the school mimics the silhouette of the old hotel. The tower is there, but it is not the hotel tower. It is a hollow echo, a modern interpretation clad in contemporary materials. It occupies the same footprint, it casts the same shadow, but it has no soul. It is a zombie building. They reconstructed the Coconut Grove, or rather, they built a theater that looks like the Coconut Grove. They recreated the Moorish arches. They painted the ceiling dark blue. They even installed modern versions of the palm trees, but it is a sterilized version. It is a high school auditorium wearing the skin of a legendary nightclub. The students who sit there for assemblies, texting on their phones, have no cellular memory of the gin, the jazz, or the desperation that once soaked the floorboards beneath their feet. The famous Paul R. Williams coffee shop, a masterpiece of Googie architecture that looked like a flying saucer had landed in the lobby, was also recreated as a faculty lounge and library. It is beautiful, yes, but it is the beauty of a wax museum. It is perfect, and it is dead. The library of the new school is perhaps the most poignant space. It is built in the location of the old Ambassador Ballroom. It is a cathedral of learning, vast and airy. But consider the overlay. The very space where students now study algebra and history is the exact same space where the Academy Awards were presented. The silence of the library replaces the applause of the Oscars. The smell of old books replaces the scent of expensive perfume. It is a palimpsest manuscript where the old text has been scraped away to make room for the new. But the faint ghostly indentations of the original words are still visible if you hold it up to the light. The most difficult decision for the architects was what to do with the pantry, the actual location. They could not build a classroom there. They could not build a cafeteria. It would be too ghoulish. Instead, they created a spiritual void. The area where the pantry stood has been turned into a library and a memorial garden. The alignment of the walls has been preserved in the landscaping. You can walk the path that RFK walked. You can stand in the spot where he fell. But now, instead of the smell of grease and gunpowder, there is the smell of jasmine and the sound of students laughing in the hallways. It is a sanitization of history. The trauma has been landscaped. As the new buildings rose, a strange phenomenon occurred. The community began to embrace the site, not as a hotel, but as a promise. The Ambassador had been a fortress that excluded the neighborhood. The school is a hub that serves it. There is a poetic justice in this. The walls that were built to keep the common people out were torn down to build a place that invites them in. The exclusivity of the past has been composted to fertilize the future. And yet, for those of us who study the dark, hidden currents of history, the feeling of unease remains. We know what is buried under the soccer field. We know what shadows linger in the peripheral vision. The construction of the school was a massive act of exorcism. It was an attempt to bury the ghost of 1968 under $500 million of steel and glass. But ghosts are not afraid of architecture. They do not care about zoning laws. The legacy of the Ambassador is not in the bricks, but in the narrative. And the narrative is a tragedy. By replacing the hotel with a school, we have essentially built a monument to the passage of time. We have codified the lesson that nothing is permanent. Not wealth, not fame, not even the buildings we construct to house them. The video footage from the opening of the school in 2010 shows beaming politicians, hopeful parents, and bright-eyed children. It is a scene of triumph. But if you turn the sound down, if you look at the angles of the buildings, you can still see the skeleton of the old beast. The school is wearing the ambassador's face. It is a mask, and the question remains, what happens when the mask slips? What happens when a student, walking late through the library, hears the faint, tinny sound of a big band playing a waltz from 1930? What happens when the plumbing rattles? Not with water, but with the sighs of the displaced spirits. The disappearance is now complete in the physical realm. The rubble has been cleared. The landfill has accepted the offering. The maps have been updated. If you search for the Ambassador Hotel on Google Maps today, it will direct you to a school. The digital record has overwritten the analog reality. But the disappearance is not just about the building, it is about the disappearance of an era. The Ambassador was the last vestige of a time when Los Angeles was trying to be Rome. Now, it is just Los Angeles. The dream of the Mediterranean fantasy has been paved over. We are approaching the end of our transmission. The signal is beginning to fade. We have traced the arc from the dairy farm to the palace, from the palace to the crime scene, from the crime scene to the ruin, and from the ruin to the school. We have dissected the corpse. But there is one final loop to close. We must look at the legacy. We must understand what the loss of the Ambassador actually means for us, the observers. We must connect the dots between the vanished hotel and the way we live now. Because this is not just a story about a building in Los Angeles. It is a story about the fragility of our own world. We are now at the shoreline of the great ocean of time. The debris has been cleared. The school bells are ringing. And the physical reality of the Ambassador Hotel has been processed into the digestive tract of history. But the disappearance leaves behind a residue that is far more radioactive than the asbestos they scraped from the walls. We must now confront the philosophical why. Why did the world's most luxurious hotel disappear? It was not merely because of a decline in real estate values or a shift in neighborhood demographics. Those are the symptoms, not the disease. The Ambassador disappeared because the world that created it ceased to exist. It was a biological incompatibility. The hotel was an organism designed to breathe the oxygen of a slower, more deliberate era of steamships, handwritten letters, and 3 martini lunches. When the atmosphere changed, when the air became thin with the acceleration of the digital age, the beast suffocated. We live today in the age of efficiency. We value speed, convenience, and optimization. We build structures that are modular, disposable, and interchangeable. A modern luxury hotel is a spreadsheet made of glass. It is identical in Tokyo, in Dubai, and in New York. It offers comfort, yes, but it offers no resistance. It does not demand that you dress for dinner. It does not intimidate you with its history. The Ambassador was different. It was difficult. It was heavy. It required a certain submission to its rules. To let it die was a collective admission that we no longer have the patience for grandeur. We traded the soul of the coconut grove for the convenience of the drive-through. We traded the velvet rope for the algorithm. This erasure speaks to a specifically American pathology, the terror of the past. Unlike Europe, where a building might stand for 500 years, accumulating scars and stories, America is a nation of constant rebirth. We are addicted to the new. We believe that if we tear down the site of the tragedy, we tear down the tragedy itself. We believe that we can bulldoze our sins. The destruction of the Ambassador was a ritual purification. We looked at the place where RFK died. We looked at the place where the decadence of the 20s rotted into the despair of the 80s, and we decided that we didn't want to see it anymore. We wanted a fresh start. But in doing so, we lobotomized our city. A city without its ruins is a city without a memory. It is a patient with amnesia, wandering the streets, unable to recall how it got there. And here lies the deepest horror. the one that should keep you awake tonight. If a monolith like the Ambassador, a structure built of steel, concrete, and the collective dreams of a century can simply vanish, can be wiped from the face of the earth so completely that only a ghost image remains, what chance do you have? We are currently building our own ambassadors, but we are building them in the cloud. We construct elaborate digital persona. We curate our Instagram feeds like the lobby of a grand hotel. We host parties in the comments sections. We build reputations on servers owned by corporations that view us as data points. We feel permanent. We feel significant. But we are far more fragile than the bricks of 1921. When the server is wiped, when the platform dies, our digital luxury will vanish without even leaving a cloud of dust. There will be no rubble to sift through. There will be no preservationists fighting for our tweets. There will be only the sudden, absolute silence of a 404 era. The Ambassador Hotel serves as a memento mori, reminder of death. It tells us that opulence is not a shield against oblivion. The champagne eventually goes flat. The flowers wilt. The music stops. The guests leave. And eventually, the lights are turned off by a man who never knew your name. The hotel is a metaphor for the human condition itself. A temporary stay in a grand room, followed by an inevitable checkout. But let us not end in total darkness. There is a glimmer of light in the concept of the legacy. The Ambassador is gone, yes, but it has been transmuted. It lives on in the films that were shot there, The Graduate, Sunset Boulevard, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It lives on in the books written about it. And, in a meta-narrative twist, it lives on in this very video. By watching this, by visualizing the lobby, by smelling the phantom smoke of the grove, you are performing an act of cognitive preservation. You are keeping the synapse firing. You are the new guest list. The disappearance of the Ambassador forces us to value what remains. It teaches us to look at the buildings in our own towns, the ones that are crumbling, the ones that are ignored, and see them not as eyesores, but as vessels of time. It challenges us to touch the texture of the real world before it is smoothed over by the digital veneer. Go out, walk the streets. Find the scars in the pavement. Listen to the silence of old places. Because sooner or later, the wrecking ball comes for everything. As the camera pulls back, rising up from the modern school, up through the smog of Los Angeles, up until the city is just a grid of lights glowing in the dark, we realize that the Ambassador was never really about the building. It was about the yearning. The yearning to be somewhere better, somewhere brighter, somewhere magical. That yearning does not die. It just moves addresses. It finds a new shell. The hotel is dead. Long live the dream. But the story of lost giants does not end here. The Ambassador was a victim of its own weight, but there are other structures, other beasts of the past, that met even stranger fates. If you felt the chill of the empty hallways in this story, if you were drawn to the silence of abandoned places, there is another mystery waiting for you. A story of a city that didn't just lose a hotel, but lost its entire population overnight. A story of a place where the coffee cups are still on the tables, but the people are gone. Click the video on your screen now. The reservation has been made. The key is in the door. All you have to do is turn it.